It is such a male view, I have to tell you. But
so
anyway,
what view?
A male view.
Male view. Actually, if we look around our own society, there are people in our own society who have a set of totalizing ideologies that is very strong. If you look at the political realm, for example, the extremes of both left and right have very powerful totalizing ideologies that have an explanation for everything and the moralizing dimension that I talked about. So the far left totalizing ideology is that the root of all evil is inequality, and the solution is to make everybody equal. And on the fringes of the right, the totalizing ideologies, so you've got the progressive and the regressive. The regressive ideology is that the root of all evil is the progressive ideology, and if we could go back to a time before we had, diversity is our strength and all the rest of it, everything would be hunky-dory. Now, why is this happening? I think that at least three things that we should highlight. The first one is the West has largely abandoned its central totalizing ideology, which was Christianity. And there are good things about this, there are bad things about this.
Funnily enough, I was brought up in an ideology. Konstantin was brought up as a victim of the ideology that my parents espoused. They were communists, British communists. And it's entirely true that if you look through, if you like, the kind of consistency of historical books and other and cultural books there, you could build up an entire picture, almost an entire picture of the world and where you stood. The only thing is that when we talk about these ideas, almost any kind of ideology, totalizing or otherwise, or grand narratives, they're just simply not the way most people ever lived their lives. So when we talk about the grand narrative of Christianity, for the vast majority of people, peasants, townspeople, etc., they might have believed in Christianity, but they had to live their lives regardless. And they lived their lives, for the most part, without reference in any substantial way. In other words, these were backgrounds to the way they behaved, just as our attitudes to certain forms of technology are the backgrounds now to the way we act.
The bad thing about grand narratives is, there's this macabre Soviet joke about a guy who invents a public shaving machine when everyone can go and get a shave. And he's explaining the concept to the people he's pitching it to, and they say, well, how does it work? And he says, well, you've got these blades, and they go up and down like this, and they chop the hair off. And they go, well, everyone's got a different face. And he goes, well, only the first time. So that's the problem with grand narratives, is they force everyone to fit into a thing that most people don't necessarily want to fit into. On the other hand, that ideological structure it's like the lattice that we can put things on so everything hangs together. Otherwise, we're just atoms floating around and unable to be a cohesive society.
Most people, when the Enlightenment was at its height, didn't know there was such a thing. And didn't live their lives according to it. They were kind of subsequently affected by it and different aspects of it. They were also affected by technological change. They were affected by economic change, which they had to respond to. They didn't move in their millions from the countryside to the towns, from living in agriculture to living in factories, which create an entirely different way of relating to each other according to any belief they had or any ideology they were given. This was the reality that they had to respond to. And that is actually, by and large, the way it is. It's all very well for the Romantics to write their great poetries, etc. And by and large, where they created a political space, it was catastrophic. And led to, some of the kind of worst elements of the grand narrative of the 20th century and so on. But that's not what most people want. What most people want is good government.
If you asked most people what they want, good governance would be on the third page. And the reason is that what most people want is meaning and purpose in their life. The point I made right at the beginning is, in a society that has been safe and comfortable and prosperous for the best part of 3 generations now, that's when you have the crisis of meaning, because no one knows what to do. Because you are surviving, your children aren't dying in infancy at a rate like they used to be in the 1940s. And then you have to ask yourself, well, if I'm not struggling and if I'm not enduring, what's the meaning of my life? And then suddenly you don't know.
I don't even begin to understand that. I honestly don't. It reminds me of those Christians who say that atheists don't have a morality, really, because you need some external force or some external belief to tell you what it is that you would think would be a better life or a worse life.
I didn't say it was external.
Around you. So let's take the issue of why you might behave well to people in the community. You might rationalize it partially as being that this is a better way of being, but you will also obviously see that if a society where people behave like that to each other is more fun and easier to live in than a society where they don't. You observe that to be a kind of way of living. Some people would take meaning from this, some people take meaning from that. One of the things you kind of discover as you look at the distribution of characteristics, of human characteristics, is that actually people are pretty different. So I can, for every person you can tell me who has a desperate need for meaning and purpose, I can show you 10 who have no such need for meaning and purpose, or find it in going to a comedy show and a very good concert and having a really good breakfast the next morning, and maybe the same breakfast every morning.
Well, it's revealing of your worldview that you've confused meaning with fun. And this is a very Western way of looking at things. If you actually venture beyond the Western world, you would find, for example, people in Russia, where I come from, fun isn't on our list of priorities. That's why we have what we call the Russian smile.
Is that why you came to Britain?
Yeah, quite. So people in different cultures, and I think you made this point beautifully earlier, Jessica, is that people value different things. But the things that they value yes, they're subjective to their culture, but what most people want ultimately, whether it's that thing about what do people say they would have rather done when they're on their deathbed or whatever, are not going to be good governance. They're going to be things that are much more personal to them, that make them feel like whatever it is that they've done with their life has been worth it. And yes, of course, you can find a bunch of nihilists who will say, yeah, going to a comedy show gives me meaning and purpose. I used to be a comedian. I can tell you there's very few people with meaning and purpose in a comedy club. Much of the ideological progress, or so-called progress we've made, has been a response to the technological reality of our society. We think, for example, that feminism liberated women. It didn't. What happened was the pill liberated women, and then feminists came along and sort of made the laws that made that more palatable.
Total nonsense.
As technology changes, we will have to see what ideology that then creates. And I think that's probably, we are in this intermediary phase where our idea of reality is fragmenting. We don't know what's true at the moment. I suspect we will look at social media much like we look at tobacco companies in the whatever 70s and 80s saying there's no harm to this. We are a kind of windscreen society now where, David and I have been in battles on Twitter calling each other all sorts of things. Here we sit being perfectly polite to each other. And that's a reflection of the fact that the way we now have conversations is mediated through a completely different prism. As that changes who we are, because that feedback is changing who we are, we will find that we do everything differently. And you've got to remember, we are living through one revolution, we're on the cusp of another. The impact AI is going to have on human beings is entirely unpredictable in my view, and very profound. So I just don't think we know.
Although I have to say just before, because you cannot get away with the idea that feminism was actually primarily enabled by the pill. Really, you can't.
Women's liberation was.
But it is such a male view, I have to tell you. But
so
anyway,
what view?
A male
view.
Yeah, it is a real.
My friend Louise Perry would be very surprised to hear that, who wrote a whole book about it. But
maybe. But when we're talking about, if you like, the notion of the capacity of the autonomous individual.
To continue watching this video, click the link in the top left or in the description below. Or visit iai.tv for more debates and talks from the world's leading thinkers on today's biggest ideas.